In the spring of 1944, the United States Army quietly assembled one of the strangest combat units of the entire Second World War. 1,100 soldiers, most of them recruited straight out of art schools and advertising agencies, armed with little more than .50 caliber machine guns for self-defense, and sent to the front lines of Europe with a mission that had nothing to do with actually fighting the enemy. Their job was to convince the German army that a handful of trucks and a couple hundred men were really an entire armored division. They did it with inflatable rubber tanks, recorded sound effects, and a talent for theater. And by the time the war ended, this unit of painters, sound engineers, and radio operators is credited with saving somewhere between 15 and 30,000 American lives, a scale of impact almost unheard of for a unit whose weapons could barely have held off a determined patrol, let alone a real German counterattack. Their story stayed classified for more than 50 years. This is the story of the Ghost Army. Officially designated the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, the unit was the brainchild of a celebrity journalist turned Army officer named Ralph Ingersoll and a colonel named Billy Harris, who had closely studied the deception tactics the British had used to great effect against German forces in North Africa and pitched American commanders on building a dedicated unit to do the same across the European theater. Activated in January 1944, the 23rd drew recruits from an unusually specific talent pool. Commercial artists, illustrators, sound engineers, radio operators, and set designers, many of them straight out of art programs at schools like Pratt Institute and Cooper Union, plucked from art classrooms and design studios and handed rifles they'd rarely, if ever, be expected to actually fire. The unit's ranks included men who would go on to considerable fame after the war, the future fashion designer Bill Blass, the painter Ellsworth Kelly among them, and reportedly carried one of the highest average intelligence scores of any unit in the entire United States Army, a fact that shaped everything about how the unit was trained and deployed. What the Army had assembled, in effect, was a fully mobile theatrical production company whose only audience was the German High Command, and whose only goal was to make that audience believe a lie convincingly enough to move real divisions and real artillery in the wrong direction. The unit operated through 4 specialized components, each handling a different layer of the illusion, working together like sections of an orchestra performing a piece of music the audience was never supposed to know was fake. The largest, the 603rd Camouflage Engineer Battalion, numbering nearly 400 men, built and deployed the inflatable rubber tanks, trucks, artillery pieces, and aircraft that have since become the most iconic image associated with the entire Operation D, decoys that could be inflated with gasoline-powered air compressors in a matter of minutes and painted with enough authentic detail, down to unit markings and weathering, to fool German aerial reconnaissance photographs taken from thousands of feet in the air. A radio deception company, roughly 300 men strong and formerly designated the 244th Signal Company before its reassignment to the 23rd, mimicked the call signs, traffic patterns, and even the individual Morse code, handwriting of real Army radio operators, convincing German listeners that a division's communications network was still active in a location its actual soldiers had long since left for somewhere else entirely. A third unit, smaller still at under 150 men and staffed with the help of engineers from Bell Labs, built an entire library of recorded sound effects. Tanks rumbling into position, trucks idling, soldiers building pontoon bridges, even scraps of overheard conversation and cursing officers, mixed to match whatever precise scenario the deception called for and played back through powerful amplifiers mounted on half-tracks, loud enough to be heard up to 15 miles away on a still night. A fourth component provided security and armed protection for the other 3, since a unit this lightly equipped needed at least some capacity to defend itself if a deception ever came close to being discovered mid-operation. And beyond the machines and the recordings, the men of the Ghost Army performed the illusion directly, wearing the shoulder patches of whatever real unit they were impersonating that week, sending officers to pose as colonels and generals in local cafes, and deliberately spreading rumors and gossip in towns where German sympathizers or spies might be listening for exactly this kind of loose talk. The Ghost Army arrived in England in early May 1944 and immediately contributed to Operation Fortitude, the sprawling Allied deception campaign designed to convince German commanders that the main D-Day landing would come at Pas-de-Calais rather than Normandy, a piece of the larger strategic bluff that helped keep entire German divisions pinned in the wrong part of France for weeks after the actual invasion had already begun. Within weeks of the actual invasion, elements of the unit crossed into France and staged one of their earliest field deceptions, simulating an entire artificial Mulberry Harbor at night using strategically placed lights, drawing German artillery fire away from the real harbor the Allies were actually using to land supplies and reinforcements onto the Normandy beachhead. By August 1944, at the besieged French port city of Brest, the unit carried out its first fully combined operation, using visual, sonic, and radio deception together to impersonate an entire armored division that had actually been pulled away to fight elsewhere, convincing a German garrison of roughly 30,000 men, dug in under a determined commander named Hermann Bernhard Ramke, that a far larger encircling force remained in place than actually did, buying time and freeing up the real division for combat duty elsewhere on the front without the Germans at Brest ever realizing their besiegers had quietly thinned out around them. The following month brought one of the unit's most genuinely dangerous assignments. Near the French city of Metz, a real gap had opened in General George Patton's front line while reinforcements were delayed in reaching the position, leaving a stretch of the front held by nothing more substantial than the Ghost Army's illusions. The Ghost Army was ordered to plug that gap, not with real combat power, since they had almost none to offer, but with the full range of their deceptive tools, simulating the presence of an entire division using every trick available to them, from staged radio traffic to inflated vehicles positioned to look like a genuine defensive line from any distance. What was supposed to be a short-term stopgap stretched into 8 or 9 days of nerve-wracking exposure, the unit maintaining its elaborate illusion directly on an active front line with essentially no real firepower behind it, hoping the Germans facing them never called the bluff before the actual reinforcements finally arrived. Every hour that passed without a German probe testing the position seriously was, by the account of men who served through it, both a relief and a fresh source of dread, since nobody could be certain the run of good luck would hold for one more night, let alone the better part of a week and a half. Patton himself, according to the men who worked with him, took an active and genuinely enthusiastic interest in the unit's methods, offering suggestions to sharpen their deceptions rather than treating the operation with the skepticism some other commanders showed toward unconventional units that didn't fit any traditional combat role. Through the winter of 1944 and into early 1945, the Ghost Army carried out a steady stream of smaller deceptions up and down the front, simulating troop buildups to distract German attention during the opening stages of what would become the Battle of the Bulge, staging phantom armored columns to help pin down elusive German panzer divisions that Allied intelligence struggled to track through the chaos of that winter's fighting, and refining a repertoire of tricks that, by this point in the war, the unit had turned into something close to a well-rehearsed traveling production, each new operation drawing on lessons learned from every deception that had come before it. But their largest and most consequential deception was still ahead of them, and it came in the war's final weeks, aimed at a target far more significant than anything the unit had previously attempted. In March 1945, as the 9th United States Army prepared to cross the Rhine River into Germany itself, the Ghost Army was given its most ambitious assignment of the entire war: convince the German defenders on the opposite bank that 2 entire American infantry divisions, the 30th and the 79th, somewhere in the range of 30,000 to 40,000 men, were massing to cross at a location roughly 10 miles away from where the real crossing would actually happen, drawing German reserves and artillery toward an empty stretch of riverbank while the genuine assault force prepared elsewhere in near-total secrecy. Codenamed Operation Viersen after a German town on the lower Rhine, The deception drew on every tool the unit had developed over the previous year at once, run at a scale the 23rd had never previously attempted in its entire operational history to that point. More than 600 inflatable vehicles were inflated and positioned across the assembly area, complete with the correct unit markings and bumper codes for the divisions being impersonated. Phony divisional and battalion headquarters were staged in a nearby town and staffed with officers playing the part of commanders who didn't exist, receiving and issuing orders exactly as a real headquarters would have, complete with the paperwork and radio discipline German intelligence would expect to see. Sonic trucks ran for multiple consecutive nights, broadcasting the sounds of pontoon bridge construction, artillery preparation, and soldiers going about the ordinary business of an army getting ready to attack, sound carrying for miles across the flat, open river valley on the still spring air. Radio operators filled the airwaves with exactly the kind of chatter two real infantry divisions would have generated in the days before a major river crossing, careful to match the volume and rhythm of genuine wartime traffic, rather than anything that might read as staged. It worked! German artillery opened fire on the fake positions on March 18th, and Allied observers noted a marked increase in Luftwaffe reconnaissance activity over the Ghost Army's staged assembly area in the days that followed. Clear evidence that German commanders had taken the bait and were reallocating their limited defensive resources to meet a threat that didn't actually exist where they thought it did. When the real Ninth Army crossed the Rhine on March 24th, at the actual crossing point 10 miles away, resistance was remarkably light. American casualties in the crossing itself numbered only in the dozens, a stunningly low toll for an operation of that scale against what should have been a heavily defended river line. 5 days later, Lieutenant General William Simpson, the Ninth Army's commanding officer, sent a formal written commendation to the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, thanking the unit directly for what he called their fine work in support of the crossing. A rare instance of a frontline Army commander formally crediting a deception unit's contribution in writing, rather than simply folding its results quietly into the broader operation's success. Across the roughly year the unit spent in the European theater, the Ghost Army carried out more than 20 separate deception operations across France, Belgium, Luxembourg, and Germany, most of them conducted within a few miles of the actual front line. A German soldier stumbling onto the wrong position at the wrong moment, at the wrong hour, could have exposed the entire unit and every man attached to it, with almost nothing standing between discovery and disaster. Given how consistently the unit operated in genuine danger, with almost no real combat power to fall back on if a deception was discovered mid-operation, its overall casualty count across the entire war was remarkably light. 3 men killed and several dozen wounded across the full run of the war, a testament both to the unit's discipline and to a fair measure of simple good fortune in never having a major deception blown at the worst possible moment, at the worst possible location, against the worst possible German unit. Decades later, an Army analyst studying the unit's missions, still working from classified files at the time and with no idea the public would ever learn what he was reading, concluded that few groups of soldiers this small had ever had so large an effect on the outcome of a major military campaign, a private assessment that, 3 decades before declassification, already anticipated exactly the verdict history would eventually reach once the full story finally became public. None of it was public knowledge for more than 50 years. The Ghost Army's operations remained classified until 1996, meaning the veterans who'd staged some of the more inventive deceptions of the entire war spent the following 5 decades unable to tell most of the people in their lives what they'd actually done during their service. Fathers, husbands, and grandfathers who quietly returned to careers as commercial artists, designers, and illustrators, carrying a genuinely remarkable secret they weren't permitted to share with wives, children, or old friends who'd simply been told they served in a camouflage unit and left it at that. Only after declassification did the fuller story finally begin reaching a wider audience, through a 2013 PBS documentary and a detailed 2015 book that finally let surviving members speak openly about what they'd done. some of them well into their 90s by the time anyone outside a small circle of historians and family members actually understood the scope of what they'd accomplished. Recognition came slower still, decades slower than most historians of the unit believe it should have. It wasn't until February 2022 that Congress passed legislation awarding the Ghost Army the Congressional Gold Medal, the nation's highest civilian honor, presented at a ceremony on Capitol Hill attended by a small handful of the unit's last surviving veterans, by then in their late 90s, finally able to be publicly thanked for a war they'd spent fighting almost entirely through imagination, artistry, and nerve, rather than the conventional courage most military honors are built to recognize. If you want to hear the story of Operation Fortitude, the much larger Allied deception effort the Ghost Army first contributed to before D-Day even began, that's a story for another video. Let us know in the comments which forgotten battle we should cover next.